my name's Sarah and I'm a scientist at Cardiff University. So just in case you were following along with the series of different topics, this is the second thing that I'm going to be talking about in the Our World and Human Impact topic. So you might have seen the video where we talked about marine habitats. We talked about what marine life is, and one of the things that we talked about was marine life is animals, plants, and other organisms that live in saltwater habitats. We talked about the impacts that humans have on marine life, and in particular we focused on plastic pollution, microplastics, and oil pollution as well. We talked a little bit about bioaccumulation, what it was, and we maybe made some fish models as well to show bioaccumulation in real life. And we talked a little bit about the things that we can all do to help to protect marine ecosystems. And some of the most important things that we can do is just reducing the amount of plastic and other pollutants that we put into the environment. We can recycle where possible, and we can reuse things as well. So we don't have to throw things away. We can reuse them in the future. So we're looking at freshwater ecosystems today, and we're going to be looking at questions. What is a freshwater ecosystem? What animals live in freshwater? What is a habitat niche? And what are the threats to freshwater ecosystems? So when we talk about freshwater, a lot of the time I think we might be confused and think that freshwater means that it's not polluted water or that it's clean water, and that's not necessarily the case. What freshwater means is it's kind of the opposite of salt water, so there isn't any salt in these ecosystems. You also get ecosystems that are somewhere between freshwater and saltwater, so you get estuaries, and you get some habitats, brackish habitats with brackish water, which is a mixture of salt water and fresh water. But today we're just going to focus on the ones that are completely freshwater, there's no salt at all. So if you've ever had a fish tank or know anyone who does, you might know that some fish are saltwater fish and some fish are freshwater fish. And if you have saltwater fish, you can't keep them in freshwater because they will die, and the same with freshwater and saltwater. So if the salt in the water has an effect on the type of animals that live there. So we're going to be looking at the type of animals that live there. So freshwater, as we've just said, it's the opposite of saltwater, and I've got a few different examples of freshwater habitats. And we've got things like ponds and rivers and lakes. We've also got different habitats like bogs, habitats like up in the corner here. So these are habitats where there's a lot of groundwater. So there's a lot of vegetation, there's a lot of plant life, and instead of being a big wide expanse of water, there's sort of little puddles, and it's a very damp, muddy habitat. And this one is a reed bed ecosystem. So there's lots of sort of areas of water, but it's also dry land as well. And all of these pictures that are on this slide here, and all of the pictures that are in this entire presentation, are Welsh places. They're places in Wales. So this is the River Wye up here. It's a Welsh pond somewhere. I think this is Cardiff Bay down the bottom. So all of the pictures that we'll see today are all places that we can visit when we're not in quarantine. So they're all different Welsh ecosystems. So a freshwater ecosystem might have lots of these different areas in it. So the benthic communities in a freshwater ecosystem, these are animals and plants and algae and organisms that live at the bottom of that pond or at that river. These are called benthic communities. Then we have lotic communities. These are sort of the animals and plants and other organisms that are floating in the middle of the water column. So they're not at the bottom, they're not at the top, they're just sort of in the middle. and this is where we find things like fish. Oh, in the benthic communities, that's where we find animals like crayfish at the bottom there. Also newts, but only sometimes of the year. Newts spend some of their time living in ponds and in other freshwater ecosystems, but newts also spend a lot of their life on dry land, so they only come into the water to breed and lay their eggs, and then they'll spend most of the rest of their time on dry land, usually in these areas that we call riparian habitats, and they'll find nice sort of damp, moist areas because they need to stay damp and moist, but they will be living on dry land. We also have surface communities, so you might have plants or animals that spend all their time on the surface. These might be things like, when we talk about plants, they might be things like lily pads. When we talk about animals, they might be things like ducks, and we've got a great crested grebe here, things like that. And we just mentioned the riparian communities. Riparian animals like otters, that we'll talk about a bit later on, and like things like grass snakes and adders as well, really like to live in these habitats. One of the things that adders really like on these riparian habitats is when you have big piles of rotting vegetation on the sides of rivers and ponds. They actually lay their eggs in those piles, and it gets really, really warm inside the piles because all of the plant material in there is rotting away, and that releases heat into the environment, and that keeps the reptiles' eggs nice and warm, and helps them to incubate them and helps them to hatch. Animals can move between all of these communities as well, so sometimes animals will spend some of their time on the bottom of the pond or the river, sometimes they'll spend some time at the surface. So things like the great crested grebe and the otter, they might spend some of their time swimming on the surface, but they also might dive down to the bottom to catch some fish that are in these sort of low-tick environments, or maybe even a crayfish off the bottom as well. So there's a lot of movement in between all of these different parts of the ecosystem as well. Okay, so now we've got some real life examples of the animals that we saw on the previous slide. Up in this corner here, this is a white-clawed crayfish. They live in those benthic communities right at the bottom of freshwater ecosystems. And I used to go and try and catch crayfish, not white-clawed crayfish, but a type of invasive crayfish called the signal crayfish. And to do that, we had to have traps, which we put some bait in, which was usually some tinned fish that smelled really, really bad. And then we used to leave that trap and the bait in it in the river for a week. And then when we came back after a week, sometimes a crayfish would have got in there and eaten all the food out of the trap. And then we'd come and get the crayfish and take out the leftover bait. Sometimes a crayfish wouldn't eat the bait, nothing would eat the bait. And so we'd have to empty out week-old rotting fish out of a crayfish trap, which was a lot of fun. And to get at the traps, we had to wear chest waders, which are kind of like wellies that come all the way up to here, like dungarees. And we had to climb into the river, and a few times we fell in, and a few times we got very wet and very muddy. So this picture in the top middle here, this is a grass snake. And you can tell this is a grass snake instead of any other type of snake because it's a nice olive green colour. And it has this sort of black area just behind its head, which looks like a bit of a collar. Grass snakes don't have any venom, so they might bite if you disturb them or if you hurt them, but they won't envenomate you. They're not very dangerous. Most of the time they're very shy and they just want to stay away from people. So unless you're doing something to hurt them, they're very unlikely to bite you. So grass snakes, they do have one defense. Instead of using venom to escape their predators, they actually release a very bad smelling oil from their anal glands. And that oil usually surprises predators and smells really terrible, so the predators are likely to drop the snake instead of eating it. The snake also pretends to be dead, so the predator doesn't want to eat something that's dead and stinks, because that's going to be bad for them, so that they drop the snake and the snake can escape. We do have one venomous snake in the UK, and that's the adder. Even if you get bit by an adder, you're very unlikely to be seriously hurt unless you have an allergic reaction to it. And you can go to any emergency room in a hospital, and they can help you and sort you out, and you'll be absolutely fine. And then on the top here, we've got a great crested grebe. And I'll put some videos about some of these animals in the resources on my Google Classroom again. But great crested grebes are one of my favourite birds, and you can go and see them in Cardiff Bay. There's lots and lots of them. And what they do is they pair up with each other. You have one male and one female usually. And the way they pair up is kind of a bit like at a school disco. So they kind of do a bit of a dance to impress each other. And what they do is they face each other, and they sort of move their heads in synchrony like that, and they sort of do this amazing dance. So I'll put a video to that. I'm not very good at doing it, but I'll put a video to that on the Google Classroom as well. So they do this incredible dance, and they sometimes dive to the bottom. They collect some pond weeds as well, which they hold in their beak, and it looks a bit like a mustache when they're shaking their heads around. And then the male and the female will build a nest together, and the female will lay some eggs. So when the babies are born, when they're sort of old enough, the parents will actually carry the babies around on their back. So the parents will be swimming along, and they'll have some little tiny baby grebes nestled in the feathers on their back, and it's very cute to see. And whichever parent is holding the baby, the other parent will go and get some food. And sometimes I've been in Cardiff Bay, and I've seen one parent with the babies on its back, and the other parent come up with some fish, and or one time an eel. And they'll take it up to the baby, and they'll try and kind of encourage the baby to come off the other parent's back, and they'll sort of give it the food and then go a bit further away and sort of come a bit closer and go a bit further away, almost like they're trying to tempt the baby to get in the water and to get off the parent's back. So they're a really lovely animal. Down in the bottom here, we've got a great crested newt. Great crested newts, they're quite rare. There's not very many of them left. There used to be more. There's a few places that you can still see them in the UK, and in Wales, in the Wildlife Trust headquarters in Monmouthshire. There's a population of great crested newts, which is where I've seen them. And I was lucky enough to see them waft, which is during the breeding season. They'll come to the males will come to the surface of the water, and they'll release a smell that entices the females. And to spread their smell around, they'll sort of swish it with their tails and waft it around so the females spread it, it's quite impressive to see. The very best time to see newts is first thing in the morning at dusk, or last thing in the evening. First thing in the morning at dawn, or last thing in the evening at dusk. And you can spot them sometimes by their eye shine, so their eyes reflect light. So using a torch, if you shine a torch over a pond, sometimes you can see their eyes reflect back. In the middle here we have salmon. Salmon are quite an interesting animal because they're not just freshwater species, they're saltwater as well. So they spend some of their time in saltwater, and then they spend some of their time in freshwater when it's time to lay their eggs. And the last animal we've got here is an otter. Otters at one point weren't doing very well in the UK. There weren't very many of them, but now they're doing a bit better. There's a few more of them, which is brilliant. A lot of the time, otters can be hit by cars when they're crossing the road, and that's one of the reasons there weren't very many of them at one stage. They are very because they eat lots of freshwater fish. If the fish are affected, there aren't going to be many otters just because they won't have enough food to eat. They don't like pollution, no animals do. So if their waterways get polluted, that affects the fish that are there for them to eat. And a lot of the time we build things on the sides of rivers, which isn't very good for freshwater animals. So that might be another reason why otters weren't doing very well at one stage. So one of my favourite things about otters is they can tell a lot about each other just through smell. And so they make scent markers, which are poo, called spraint. And the spraint kind of tells a bit of a story about the otter that left it. So by smelling each other's spraint, otters can tell how old the other otter is. They can tell whether the other otter is a boy or a girl. They can tell whether that otter is ill or whether they're healthy. They can tell lots of different things about other otters. So if you would like to pause this video and have a little go at this experiment, there's a tutorial for this experiment on my Padlet and also in my Google Classroom if you want to have a go. So what this experiment is doing is making some fake otters out of some common ingredients that you might have in your house, things like herbs and spices and citrus zest. You can use those to make different scents. We're going to make cardboard cutouts of otters and then challenge family members to see if they can smell otters and remember which otter is theirs through smell alone. So if you want to have a go at that, as I say, you can pause the video and go have a go. Okay, so we've looked at what a freshwater ecosystem is. We've looked a little bit about what animals live in freshwater as well. And now we're going to talk about what a habitat niche is. So a habitat niche is the part of an ecosystem where an animal sort of fits in. It's a specific job or a role that an animal does in an ecosystem. We talked about all of these different places in an ecosystem, like the benthic animals, the lotic animals, surface living animals, and the riparian animals. These are all different niches in habitats that plants and animals will occupy, and they'll all sort of have different jobs in these habitats. So we also said about how animals can move through these habitats as well, and spend time in different parts of habitats. One way we can kind of think about it is animals like earthworms, or they do things like they move through the soil and they aerate the soil, and because the worms do this, the plants are able to grow. Bees and other insect pollinators will go from plant to plant spreading pollen. If they didn't do that, the plants wouldn't be able to grow. So it's kind of like the job they have and the role that they play in the ecosystem. In freshwater ecosystems, we've already said that otters depend on other animals for the food that they eat. Otters also do an important job because they keep down populations of other animals. So by eating the fish, eating the big fish, they're giving little fish a chance to survive and not be eaten themselves. And they help the ecosystem as well. So all animals have their different sort of place that they live in an ecosystem and the different job that they do in that ecosystem. And then we've got our benthic communities, lotic, our surface communities, and riparian, and our otter. So we've talked about what a freshwater ecosystem is, the animals that live there, what is a habitat niche and the different habitat niches that are in these freshwater ecosystems. And last thing we're going to talk about today is what are the threats to freshwater ecosystems. Okay, so one of the threats to these ecosystems, to saltwater ecosystems as well, but freshwater ecosystems, is overfishing. And that's when we take out too many fish from an ecosystem, and this can have lots of different problems. So one of the kind of most obvious problems is if we take out lots and lots of fish for us to eat maybe, then there aren't as many fish for other animals to eat. So this might be one of the reasons why at one point otters weren't doing very well, as there just weren't enough fish for them to eat because humans were eating them all. Other animals might have been affected by that, things different predatory birds who depend on big fish to eat. So that might be one of the ways that overfishing can hurt these types of ecosystems. Another way is that sometimes it depends on the type of fishing, but sometimes the fishing that we do can stir up the communities on the bottom of the freshwater ecosystem. So when you stir up these communities, you might be sort of harming lots of very small organisms that larger organisms depend on for their food. You might be uprooting plant life or algae that other animals need to eat to survive. Or one thing that can happen is when you disturb the sediment, the mud, the muck at the bottom of the pond, you might be releasing different pollutants into the other layers of the ecosystem. So as I was saying, predatory birds like herons, they depend on large fish to eat to be able to sustain themselves. So if there aren't enough large fish in an ecosystem because we fished them all, the heron doesn't have any food. Ospreys as well, and otters, they depend on having enough fish to eat. Another interesting thing that might happen from overfishing is when we take out all of the big fish in a population for us to eat, all that's left is the little fish. So the little fish go on to have their babies, and their babies all tend to be small as well. So we have big fish that have babies who are bigger, and little fish have babies who are smaller. So when we're taking out all of the big fish, we're left with nothing but little fish, and then they have their babies which are little again, and then they have their babies which are small again. So all of the fish in a population start to get smaller. And that can be a problem as well for big predators that depend on these fish to survive. Another problem with not so much overfishing, but one solution that we've kind of come up with to overfishing is fish farms. So we keep lots and lots of fish, a bit like cows or sheep or chickens. We keep them on a farm, so there's lots for us to eat. So that means that we're not affecting natural habitats, and we're not taking food away from other animals. But sometimes it's not very fun for the fish. Sometimes fish can get things like parasites, which are animals that live on or inside of the fish, and they kind of eat the fish while the fish is still alive. So this parasite here is sort of feeding on the mucus and maybe even the blood of the fish while the fish is still alive. And this is such a big parasite that if I had a parasite the same size, it would be like having a West Highland Terrier kind of attached to my face, which would be huge. And I wouldn't want that. So sometimes overfishing can cause problems like parasites like this. So it's not necessarily the best solution, but it is a solution to harming wild ecosystems. Okay, another thing that can be a problem for freshwater ecosystems is when we talked about that riparian habitat. I don't know if I explained exactly what riparian habitat is. It's the habitat on the edges of freshwater ecosystems, so the kind of banks of a river or the areas around the outside of a pond. So these are really important habitats for things like otters to make their homes in, some birds to build their nests. Lots and lots of different animals depend on these riparian habitats, especially insects. Lots and lots of insects lay their eggs in the water, and then the larvae emerge and live in the water, and the adults crawl out of the water and go off and fly away. So for them, the riparian habitat is really, really important for places for their young to emerge from the river. or the pond or whatever fresh water ecosystem it is. Ways that we're losing this kind of habitat are invasive plants like this is Himalayan balsam. It's also called touch me not. It's got explosive seed pods that when you touch them, they kind of explode and eject the seeds. That's one of the reasons this is able to spread so quickly and so well, is because of this explosive seed release. So it's able to take up entire riverbanks, and the roots are very, very shallow, so they don't help to keep the riverbank together. And when there's lots of rain or other sort of wet weather conditions, big areas of the riverbank can slide down into the river. So we're losing lots and lots of habitat. Himalayan balsam can also stop other plants from growing in the same places. So that's a big problem too. I am going to put a slow motion video of the Himalayan balsam, or the touch me not, exploding its seeds in slow motion, because even though this is a invasive species and it's very, very bad for our river habitats, it is really cool how it spreads its seeds. Yeah, so animals like grass snakes depend on these riparian habitats to lay their eggs. And sometimes you might see grass snakes swimming through the water. They eat frogs and toads quite a lot, and small fish. And one of our most endangered animals, which is the water vole. There's not very many of these water voles left. In South Wales, you can see these, you can see their habitat in Megan Marsh. It's very difficult to see water voles themselves, though. They're very secretive, and they're very, very shy. But they are beautiful animals, and one of the most important reasons that we need to take care of these riparian habitats. Another reason we might be losing riparian habitat is because we build on it. We really like to build on the sides of freshwater and saltwater habitats. Lots of people like to live by the sea. Lots of people like a river view house or a lake view house. So a lot of the time we're losing a lot of riparian habitat because we're building on it. And this is Cardiff Bay. It's one example of where we've kind of created something completely artificial out of a natural habitat. So Cardiff Bay used to be a salt marsh with lots and lots of birds that lived there. And in the year 2000, they built a barrage, a tidal barrage, which stopped the water flowing out and created this huge freshwater lake. So it is an example of where we've kind of put lots of buildings around a natural habitat and changed a habitat for our own use. I think our final example of ways that our actions might damage or pollute our environment is eutrophication. And we talked a little bit about this in when I talked about marine habitats. So the way eutrophication works is usually chemicals such as fertilizers will run off the land and will end up in our freshwater ecosystems. And fertilizer can be natural. It can be things like cow poo and chicken poo that runs off from farms, or it could not be natural. It might be an artificial fertilizer that farmers spray onto their crops to help them to grow a bit faster. And the problem with all of these chemicals is a lot of it is wasted and flows away down into freshwater ecosystems, where it acts as food for algae. The algae really loves this fertilizer and goes a bit crazy and starts to grow out of control until it completely covers the surface of maybe the pond or the lake where it is. So that green gunk that you might see on the top of a slow flowing river or a pond or a lake, that's actually algae that's grown out of control. The problem with this is that it grows so quickly and it covers absolutely everything, and it stops any sunlight getting to the bottom of the freshwater ecosystem. And what happens when the sunlight can't get down? The plants that are underneath that layer and the algae that's underneath that layer, they all die. When they die, there's nothing to produce oxygen in that ecosystem, and so then bigger animals that need the oxygen to breathe can't breathe, and so they might die as well. Other sort of sources of pollutants that kind of end up in the freshwater ecosystems is from our wee and our poo. So lots of things that are in our diet, if we're taking medication or if we're taking vitamins and things like that, that's going to end up in our urine and our feces, and then eventually maybe ending up in freshwater ecosystems, which is no good for the ecosystems. And then one thing that we can all definitely do to try and help prevent pollution is the last thing, which is bread from people feeding ducks and geese. So lots and lots of us love to go, and I do too, love to go and feed ducks and geese and things like that. And up until kind of recently, what everyone fed them was bread. What happens then is that can decay and dissolve in the freshwater ecosystem and cause this eutrophication, cause this pollution. One of the other things that can happen is it's not very good for ducks at all. They really, really like it, but it's a bit like junk food for us. We really love junk food. We love sweets and cake and chocolate. But if we ate it all the time, we know that we would be very unhealthy, and that's the same for ducks. So if they're just eating bread, they're not getting any other nutrients. It fills their bellies, but they're not having any room for nutrients then. So it's very bad for the animals. So if you do love animals and you do love going and feeding ducks, then it's a good idea to feed them different things. And that's what we're going to be talking about now, is what you can feed. So these are some examples of some food that ducks really do like to eat, and that are going to be good for them too. So porridge oats we've got in the top corner here. Those are really nice. They float on the water as well, so the ducks won't have to dive to get them. They'll float on the top. Peas, fresh or frozen or tinned peas. If you're using any type of frozen veg, just make sure that it's had time to defrost, so it's not really cold for the ducks to eat. You can also make use of your kitchen waste, so vegetable peelings, any leftover salad like lettuce, they'll eat that as well, and birdseed. They really enjoy birdseed. Geese seem to really enjoy birdseed. I've actually recorded a video for you to go and have a watch after this, of me feeding some geese, and I've used different foods. I've used frozen vegetables, which I took the time to defrost so they weren't cold. I used birdseed, and I also used popcorn. And you can feed ducks and geese popcorn, but what's really important is you use popcorn that hasn't been flavoured in any way, so not salted, no butter on it, no sugar on it, nothing on it. So you can buy popcorn kernels, which you can then pop at home, and those are the best things to feed them because they haven't got anything added to them that's going to hurt the animals. So if you want to go and have a watch that video, that's on my Google Classroom, so you can look at that and have a go at analysing the birds' behaviour. What foods do they like the best? What foods don't they like? Have a guess first of all. What foods you think they're going to enjoy and what foods that you don't think they'll enjoy, and see if you were right at the end. There's also a worksheet, so if you want to have a go at analysing that video and make an experiment out of it, you can have a look at that worksheet. Okay, so there's one other way that we can have an impact on these freshwater animals, and this isn't just true for animals in freshwater habitats, it's true for lots and lots of different animals. But one of the main reasons I wanted to mention traffic collisions is because it's such a problem for otters. Lots and lots of otters are killed on roads. So there are ways that we can avoid this and try and stop animals being killed on the roads. One way is to dig tunnels under roads. So when a new road is being built, they can include things to help animals to cross that road. So things like tunnels underneath. We could put signs in. Signs might encourage drivers to slow down and be more careful and watch out for any wildlife that's on the road. And there's another example of a tunnel as well that animals can use to cross roads safely. Okay, so we've looked at pretty much all of our key questions for today. We've looked at what is a freshwater ecosystem. We've kind of looked at how that's the opposite of saltwater and what that means. We've looked at the type of animals that live in freshwater and where in freshwater ecosystems they live. We've looked at what a habitat niche is. We kind of decided that that was the different kind of places in an ecosystem where animals live, but also the kind of roles that they play and the jobs that they do in that ecosystem. And we also looked at the potential threats to animals in these ecosystems. So just to finish up today, I mentioned earlier that I worked on signal crayfish and virile crayfish a while ago. So our native crayfish, the white claw crayfish, are becoming very endangered and they're all dying out. And that's in part due to the signal crayfish and the virile crayfish kind of kicking them out of their habitats. One very important thing that you can do to help freshwater environments is, if you like to go fishing or you just like to have a look and do a bit of pond dipping, if you find one of these animals, if you find a signal or a virile crayfish, it's very, very important that you don't move them to another freshwater ecosystem. So what you don't want to be doing is taking them anywhere that you find them to anywhere else. Definitely don't do that. And any nets or any buckets, any equipment that you've used in that pond or that freshwater habitat, make sure that you wash it really, really well. Wash it with hot soapy water and let it dry in the sun so that UV radiation can kill any bacteria or anything that might make other animals sick. So you don't want to spread any diseases from one freshwater ecosystem to another. So that's a really important thing that you can do to help these environments. Okay, so that's about everything for this week on freshwater habitats. If you have any questions for me, you can ask me on Twitter at EcoExploreEDU. You can also ask me on my Facebook page, EcoExplore Education. You can also join my Google Classroom, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. And I'll also leave the code for my Google Classroom in case you'd like to join. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.